Welcome to Hollywood Remixed, a topical podcast about inclusion and representation in culture and entertainment. I'm Rebecca Sun, Senior Editor of Diversity and Inclusion at The Hollywood Reporter. If you're just joining us for the first time, here at Hollywood Remixed, each episode is dedicated to a single theme, a trope or an identity that has been underrepresented or misrepresented in mainstream culture. This week's theme is a special twofer. We're tackling the martial artist stereotype and its close relationship to portrayals of Asian masculinity in Western pop culture. Our special guest is none other than Simu Liu, star of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, out exclusively in theaters on September 3rd. Simu not only plays the world's most elite and reluctant martial artist in the much-anticipated Marvel movie, he's also someone who in real life has been quite candid and introspective about Asian gender dynamics, so I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. To kick off this episode, I've invited my friend Keith Chow, editor-in-chief of the pop culture blog The Nerds of Color, to talk about how the pervasive martial artist trope has affected Asians growing up in America in real life, and also to discuss how Hollywood's martial arts projects have employed, or, as the case often was, excluded, Asian and Asian American performers from narratives inspired by their own cultures of origin. I first got to know Keith about 7 years ago when he originated the hashtag AA Iron Fist campaign, a public plea for Marvel and Netflix to cast an Asian American Iron Fist, something that we will rehash during our segment. Keith's bona fides as a connoisseur of culture and comic books are fairly impeccable. He was a co-editor on the Asian American comics anthologies Secret Identities and Shattered, and he hosts both the podcasts Hard Knock Life, that's NOC Life, and Southern Fried Asian. Keith, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have you on because, this episode is about the martial arts genre in Hollywood, as well as sort of how that's affected Asian Americans. And, we were talking, earlier before we started recording about how a lot of us as Asian Americans, Asian people growing up in this country had a conflicted relationship with that. So tell me a little bit about your own sort of evolving relationship with martial arts as a trope or as a genre.
Yeah. No, I'm so honored to be on here with you, Rebecca. I think, like you said, for most of us, especially Chinese Americans growing up, it was just kind of in the air. Like our families had the video, the VHS tapes or whatever, and Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee were always kind of in the ether. But I was never like, an obsessive of like Kung Fu cinema, the way that like my non-Asian friends were. I had a lot of non-Asian friends who could tell you everything about this Bruce Lee movie, that Jet Li movie or whatever. And I kind of always shied away, at least as a young person, because I think it's the same reason that so many actors kind of don't want to be pigeonholed. It's like that feels foreign and I want to reject foreignness. I am an all-American, right? Like I like apple pie and football, right? And you
grew up in Virginia, which is probably relevant.
That's right. I'm Southern Fried Asian right here. And that kind of helped to change my attitudes. But I think that was the main thing. It's like, like I saw the poor dubbing and thought, oh, that's ridiculous. And I never really appreciated it as a kid. When I got a little bit older, I started studying some martial arts and started gaining a new appreciation for it. But like, my brother calls me a poser because I liked Crouching Tiger. And he's like, well, Crouching Tiger is kind of like Kung Fu for white people. I'm like, all right. That's what first brought me around,
Yeah, and so you mentioned the dubbing, and so I guess for anybody who is really coming into this totally new, let's talk a little bit about what you're talking about when you start dubbing. How did martial arts movies, sort of become a popular genre in American pop culture? Where did they come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really, there were samurai movies that would become like, Clint Eastwood movies back in, in the 50s and 60s. But I think like that real kind of, when we think of Kung Fu cinema, it's like the 70s, right? It's like blaxploitation and Kung Fu cinemas were what they showed in like inner cities. And that's kind of like where the Wu-Tang Clan comes from, right? Like that's the genesis. And that's when, I was born and came of age. It was in the late 70s, early 80s. And so you have people like, of course, Bruce Lee was, he was a god in the 70s, but after him came, Jackie and Jet in the 80s and 90s. And the other, like, I feel like the second, renaissance, I guess, was the 90s when you had Jackie and Jet really became super popular, crossing over, Rumble in the Bronx and Once Upon a Time in China, and then eventually doing American movies with like, the Rush Hour films and
Aaliyah.
and then Romeo Must Die. Yeah. R.I.P. Aaliyah, 20 years. So that's kind of like that second wave was like, I was cool with martial arts movies, but at the same time, it was always, they're still foreigners. Like it was always about the culture clash. It was about this guy who could barely speak English interacting with, do you understand the words coming out of my mouth? Like that was the big joke.
That was the big catchphrase. That was the catchphrase literally from that entire franchise. Yeah.
And we were talking about like the dubbing piece when I was a kid kind of being a distraction for me. I just couldn't wrap, and not even like English dubbing, because like what people don't understand is that all of those movies were dubbed in Chinese too. Like they weren't speaking words. They would just move their mouth and some other cat would come into the booth and record their dialogue, because they would do like a Mandarin dub and a Cantonese dub. And it was never like Jet Li's voice when he was playing Wong Fei Hung, right? It was always just some other guy's voice. And I just knew that intrinsically as a young person, and it just turned me off. And that's another reason why I was like, this ain't for me. This ain't my bag. I can't deal with it.
It's interesting. They still do that, a lot in sort of Chinese dramas and things like that, because there are so many different dialects, spoken across the Chinese diaspora. And sometimes you'll just have like a random like Korean actor in there that they'll just dub over in Chinese, but the Korean actor's popular and famous. So it's a great and hilarious trend. So let's talk specifically about the performers, because I think that that's where you and I really, our own interest in, martial arts as sort of a Hollywood cultural genre really comes into play. What kinds of opportunities were given to performers of Asian descent? And particularly when we talk about the difference between people from Asia, like Jackie Chan and Jet Li, who by the way, there was that recent survey that came out where like 46% of Americans can't name a single, 46% say, I don't know, when they're asked, name an Asian American. And then the next biggest grouping of people said Jackie Chan.
Right.
Who is not an Asian American. Anyway.
And hasn't been famous in America for like 30 years.
Well, the third most popular answer was Bruce Lee, who's, rest in peace, literally been dead for 50 years, a half a century. So we're doing really well.
Yeah.
But yeah, what kinds of opportunities have been available for, within this genre?
Yeah, that's the thing. And I think, going back to what I said earlier about why so many Asian American performers and actors kind of, like me as a kid, run away from the idea of martial arts, is that it's a stereotype. And so, there was a stigma of kind of this like perpetual foreignness that stigmatizes so many Asian Americans writ large, right? And it's this idea that it's not cultural, it's this kind of weird exotic cultural thing, and it's not like, intrinsic to like, it's what and when we say people, we mean white people would accept, right? And I think that that's part of the reason why, the only American martial artists that got any kind of traction were white guys. Chuck Norris, Steven Seagal, Jean Van Damme, right? Jean-Claude Van Damme. And, this kind of like leads you to think that like, that's why, as an Asian American, I kind of always wanted to say, like, why can't an Asian American be that guy? Why can't there be an Asian American Jean-Claude Van Damme or an Asian American? Like, that's the 180 I made, right? It's not that I disrespected like Jet Li or Jackie Chan, but I knew intrinsically, like you said, they're not even American. Like, why can't a Brandon Lee, another person who's been gone for several decades, he was probably the only one in that kind of wave of the late 80s, early 90s who could have been, an Asian American martial artist superstar, and just we were robbed of that, too soon. So, but yeah, I think, but other than that, like so many Asian performers are like, I don't even do martial arts. Why are you, I'm auditioning for romantic comedy. Why are you asking me? It's like the accent thing, right? Like we don't want to do an accent because, again, there's a stigma attached, because I've also come around on the idea of accents. Like, accents are authentic to who our like parents are. There's nothing wrong with an accent, but it's this expectation from like normally white, definitely non-Asian casting directors that like, if you're going to be Asian, you must speak in an accent, you must do martial arts, even if you are auditioning for like a romantic comedy. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. It's like there's nothing intrinsically wrong with having an accent or knowing martial arts, but I think the problem is when every Asian is expected to come with those two characteristics, where it becomes stereotypical and limiting. So, when you talked about that first and second wave, Bruce Lee, which, it's so crazy because his legacy is enormous and has really reverberated and obviously lasted for decades. But his active period was very was tragically brief. I think he died in 1973 and his first movie, The Big Boss, had come out only in 1971. So this is a very small canon that the world was sort of allowed to get from him. So after he passed in the early 70s and like Rumble in the Bronx came out, I think it was like the mid 90s. That's like 20 years. That's almost 25 years of a gap, a total void of sort of Asian leads. However, not a void in like projects that were inspired by martial arts. And you mentioned, there was there has been and still is a rise of white stars who became martial arts practitioners, but also got to become leading men, as well as I think we should just mention that Hollywood had, they began remaking some of these martial arts movies as literal Westerns, like cowboy movies out in the West that were like remakes of Kurosawa films. Right. Seven Samurai became The Magnificent Seven, or Yojimbo became A Fistful of Dollars. So that's all to say whitewashing is a long and storied practice in the theme that we're talking about today. Let's give a little mention of Kung Fu, starring David Carradine, and I think a very stark example of, I think the story, I think this is what the official story is now, that was an original Bruce Lee pitch, right?
Right. Yeah, you mentioned Bruce, and that was, his idea. He had this idea of a story called The Warrior about a Chinese monk who comes to the American West and to search, I think in his story was to search for his sister. And then, the famous story is that he pitched it to, I think, ABC or one of the broadcast
Warner's,
networks.
But somebody,
somebody. And they were like, oh, this is a great idea, but we can't have a Chinese guy as the lead in a primetime network drama. Are you kidding? Even though at that point, Bruce was fairly popular. He'd just come off of Green Hornet. He had some notoriety, especially within the Hollywood kind of like scene, right? Like he was famously trained Steve McQueen and James Coburn and everybody. So like, it's not like he didn't have clout in Hollywood. It was just that like, the Oriental as a leading man was just like unheard of. So that's what eventually prompted him to go back to Hong Kong and become a superstar. And, before he came back to do Enter the Dragon, which again came out after he died. But, that famous story was kind of like one of the origin points of like how we look at whitewashing in Hollywood. And that's only, 40 years later being rectified by two projects, right? Like you have the reboot of Kung Fu on CW, which is taking the actual IP of the David Carradine show, but like reimagining with actually Chinese people this time, and then a Chinese woman as the protagonist. And then you have HBO Max's Warrior, which takes the actual writings of Bruce's and kind of recontextualizes, but sets this story starring Andrew Koji in, the Old West and kind of more follows, makes it a little bit sexier for like HBO Max, but like follows the story.
It's a real sexy show.
Yeah. that was set forth by Bruce. And so like, that's kind of shows the evolution of how we view martial arts in America, right? Like the show that Bruce envisioned 40 years ago is now finally coming to fruition in two different ways, right? Like you have Kung Fu and Warrior, but it took 40 years, to your point, right? Like it's that long kind of gap where it was just accepted that things would be whitewashed, including like something as significantly and culturally Chinese as Kung Fu.
It's really, how do I say this without sounding disrespectful to David Carradine? But I like, if you put Bruce Lee and David Carradine next to each other and are like, who's got more of like the leading man charisma, star power, wattage, and can also do martial arts. It seems crazy, but then again, like Iron Fist is the thing, and that choice happened. So I guess maybe we're just crazy. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah. Spoiler alert.
Exactly. Before we go into sort of how things have been for the last decade, there's one more person that I wanted to mention who is, there are lots of, let me back up. There have been a lot of Asian martial arts practitioners, over the decades who have been able to work primarily as stunt performers, like nameless bad guys. They don't get to be the hero.
Right.
Again, Bruce Lee had to leave the country that he was born in, the United States, and go to Hong Kong in order to actually become a leading man. However, there have been tons and tons of Asian stunt performers of Asian descent, people who have done a lot of martial arts movies, one of whom I just want to acknowledge is Sonny Chiba, who passed away on August 19th. When I brought up Sonny Chiba earlier, before we started recording, Keith, you talked a little bit about how in the obits and the various tributes that we've seen in the past several weeks since his passing, people keep talking about Quentin Tarantino. Let's talk a little bit about our pal QT, the patron saint of importing martial
Asian
arts
cinema.
Movies. Yes, that was my introduction to Quentin Tarantino in the 90s. I remember people were like, "Oh, he's so great. He's like allowed us to like he's exposed all of these like Asian
He's graced
cinematic
us with his presence."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, I mean, trust me, as someone who in the 90s was a pretentious college student who loved, and I still love, Wong Kar-wai movies, the stain on my VHS cassette of Chungking Express is this 20-minute intro of Quentin Tarantino, just like slobbering all over Wong Fei. And that kind of, just doesn't hold up 20 years, 30 years later. But no, I mean, the sad part to me is that Sonny Chiba, for so many film Twitter or whatever, he's so tied to Tarantino, and it's so unfair. But it's that kind of idea that that's another kind of whitewashing, right? That someone whose career is as storied as Sonny Chiba, this is good. Gordon Liu is another example of someone who's has a storied career in Chinese cinema, but because he was in Kill Bill, the guy Quentin Tarantino discovered, right? That's the kind of thing that really, it just, I fucking hate it, is what I'm saying, right? And the thing is too is with Tarantino, we were talking about Bruce Lee, he doubles down on his Bruce Lee disrespect, right? The whole Once Upon a Time in Hollywood thing. And part of what you were saying about Asians who have been martial artists have never been able to be the leading man. They've always been the cannon fodder or the villain, right? But never the central, complex, three-dimensional character. And that's the thing about the martial arts stereotype that has always been troublesome for Asians. And, so advocating for an Asian martial artist isn't in itself wrong. If that Asian martial artist gets to be three-dimensional and gets to be romantic and funny and charismatic, right? Because whenever you did see an Asian face in a martial arts movie made in the West, it was either the, butt of a joke, or, like I said, just his whole role is to be beat up by the typically good white guy. And Tarantino leans into that with the icon of Asian Americans, Bruce Lee. And it isn't so much that Bruce Lee would never lose a fight to Brad Pitt, although Bruce Lee would never lose a fight to fucking Brad Pitt. It's that he's treated as a joke in that scene. Yeah, he was arrogant, but you don't treat the whole point of the character of Bruce Lee in that scene in Once Upon a Time is that he is a joke. And that's what's disrespectful.
And Tarantino has since doubled down because he's been making the press rounds again, to promote the book. And what really strikes me is how invested he is in taking Bruce Lee down a peg.
Yeah.
I'm just bro, what's it to you? That seems he keeps talking about how, you said, how arrogant he was and kind of willfully misinterpreting people's actual firsthand accounts. The journalist, he keeps citing this Bruce Lee biography, and the writer has been on Twitter saying that's that's not what I wrote.
Right.
But it is very interesting. Like, I think it's a subconscious thing that I don't believe Tarantino himself has really fully interrogated, which is, why is it so important to him that that his made up character is able to beat up this actual real life person, like it can beat him in a fight. And also that this guy was so disrespectful to the white stuntman. He was so disrespectful. Like it definitely has that whole, I mean, it's
like
got
the uppity Chinese guy, that's what he's saying about Bruce Lee.
Exactly. And I don't know if Tarantino has thought about that. That's what he's actually doing, but it's quite distressing. So, okay, enough with Tarantino. Let's fast forward a bit and then talk about the past few years, because you mentioned, it's only very recently. It was almost like, it was really Shannon Lee who was like, all right, enough of this, Bruce Lee's daughter, being like, getting 2 shows on the air, so there's Warrior and Kung Fu, and they really do, like you said, represent the spectrum, because one is on the CW and the other is on HBO Max.
Right.
Fun for all ages. But you've also got films, they're finally now like Hollywood making martial arts centric films with mostly Asian ensembles, like Mortal Kombat, like Snake Eyes. First of all, why do you think this shift has happened? Like, what has now suddenly precipitated the shift? Because Iron Fist came out in 2017, which was 4 years ago, and they were not willing to put an Asian in the lead back then. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you mentioned it. Like, the only reason I'm on this podcast right now, the only reason anyone knows what my name is that back in 2014 when they were announcing Iron Fist, I said, hey, you know what would be cool? Maybe you get an Asian American guy to play Danny Rand, right? Because Iron Fist also comes from that like period we were talking about earlier, where the kung fu cinema was so popular. Like both of those characters, Luke Cage and Iron Fist, was like Marvel's exploitation of blaxploitation in kung fu cinema. Like, let's get a character that's straight out of, Shaft, and a character straight out of like
Let's make our own.
And make our own, right? And that was kind of like the origin of the Heroes for Hire. And so when they announced that they were bringing them to Netflix, it was just to me like, oh, here's a perfect example that like, white guy Danny Rand made sense maybe in the 60s and 70s, but come on, like right now, let's have an Asian American guy play it. There's no reason, there's nothing about the Danny Rand character that's inherently white, right? Mm-hmm. He's an American, but he's not necessarily white. And so I was like, why not make it, his biggest, character trope is that he's a fish out of water, because he's this white guy who trains to become like the best kung fu fighter in the world by a bunch of Asian people. So, but, and that was the pushback I got when I did my whole like campaign for Asian American Iron Fist. It was like, well, he's supposed to be a fish out of water. And as if like, if you and I were to go to China right now, we wouldn't be fishes out of water. Fishes out of water? Is that grammatically correct? But that was kind of the whole impetus, is that like, I wanted to have a character who was, like I said earlier, 3-dimensional, heroic, funny, sexy, like all of those things that Asian martial artists never get to be. And that was the, truth be told, I didn't give a shit about Iron Fist. That's like, he's not my favorite character. And then a lot of like people on Twitter would like find me saying that and like, see, he doesn't care. It's like, yeah, I don't give a shit about Iron Fist. No one really gives a shit about Iron Fist.
Yeah. I know one person for whom it was his favorite character. Is very invested in Danny Rand.
Yeah, I'm sure he was in your mentions for the last 5 years, right? Yeah, same. But that was like the opportunity that they had, right? And speaking of shitting on Iron Fist, like talking about recent stories, there was the stunt coordinator, I think Brett Chan, who was like, "Oh yeah, Finn Jones didn't want to train." Like he had no desire.
It was so crazy to see Iron Fist.
Jessica Henwick was like totally invested. But Finn, he didn't give a shit. You know what I mean? And that was like doubly insulting, right? Like,
so curious. You could not tell on screen based on his action performances.
But that was kind of like that first, and that conversation happened before it really like hit the fan for Hollywood. Like that predated Oscar So White. That predated, starring John Cho, whitewashed out.
That was like, I think that came right before Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah.
ScarJo, and that was 2015. So yeah,
so
the
like
Iron Fist
the
announcement
Iron Fist thing was like
2014.
end of 14, beginning of 15. But then there was that was I think the watershed moment for us in Hollywood, right? Because it was you had like these back to back to back castings of like Emma Stone as Allison Ng in Hawaii in Aloha. You had Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One in Doctor Strange. You had ScarJo as
Motoko Kusanagi,
the major in Ghost in the Shell, and also you had Matt Damon in the Great Wall. You had all of these like castings of like centering white people in these Asian stories. Even the Doctor Strange Strange could have been an Asian American, right? Mm-hmm. That's when we did our Whitewashed Out campaign. That's when the Starring John Cho campaign came out, kind of like pointing to the thing that we've been talking about as you and I as advocates in the Asian American space for several decades. We've been talking about this was old hat for us, but somehow it penetrated in that 2015, 2016 year, really like leading to, John Chu's told me, it's like that conversation you guys were having on the internet is what got me in the room for Crazy Rich Asians. Like had we just normally just been ignored like we always are, maybe Crazy Rich doesn't come out. And if Crazy Rich doesn't come out, we don't have like Henry Golding and Gemma Chan and Awkwafina and all of these movies.
And
now.
we're probably not sitting here today talking about Shang-Chi.
Exactly, right? I mean, I think there is a direct line from not what the Nerds of Color did, but like that conversation writ large, right? Starting with Iron Fist through like, the Ancient One and Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah, the momentum from that movement. It is really remarkable to think about where we were all sitting just less than 10 years. Well, when I say that, it sounds like a long time, but like 7 years ago, right? Like, I writing about this type of thing for reading your op-eds in Nerds of Color, writing my own pieces here at THR, and really feeling like you were just sort of like shouting into a void, like there were like people were talking about it, but it somehow wasn't penetrating the upper echelons of the people who make decisions. Until these things kind of just like flopped one after the other. Yeah. They just bombed in succession. And then I think then they were like, maybe the Asians have a point. But but it's so interesting actually when you kind of lay it out that way that, even though today, and it's so delightful that we're not doing an episode on like the totality of Asian American representation, we're only talking about the martial arts genre. And yet you're absolutely right that it was sort of a successive concentration like of outrages within just sort of like the simple act, not the simple act, but the chronic act of whitewashing in like Hollywood treatments of like martial arts and other sort of traditionally Asian cultural genres has now opened the door to like this huge I can't even say renaissance because there was no original version of it, this huge birth of I think finally like a mainstreaming of Asian American representation in Hollywood in a way that truly has never existed and has transcended any specific genre,
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's what I mean. Like, the through lines, if you go Iron Fist, Doctor Strange, Crazy Rich Asians, Shang-Chi, right? Like it's, you have this like, opulent romantic comedy in the middle, but you're right, because it's not about necessarily the genre, but it's just about the representation. And, like, I think too, is that with that conversation, and especially pushing for an Asian American Iron Fist, like I said, the pushback wasn't just like fish out of water. It was also like, why would you want an Asian American, like if you're all about advocating for representation, why do you want the stereotype? Why do you want the martial artists? Right? Because again, that's the thing that we talked about earlier. Like that's the stereotype. We want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. But it was like, but we've never had an opportunity to have an Asian American martial art. It's like we almost just gave that up and said, here, Jean-Claude Van Damme, you can represent, martial arts. Because we don't want, I mean, and that kind of thinking is what led to a Tilda Swinton playing the Ancient One, right? It was Marvel was very upfront saying, well, we knew that the mentor old Chinese guy is such a stereotype. We knew this was a
stereotype, yeah.
So to avoid the stereotype, we just thought we'd go the other direction, change the gender, change the race, so it wouldn't be and what they don't realize is that the problem isn't the race of the character. The problem is how that type of character has always been portrayed, right? So what they did in giving the role to Tilda Swinton, it wasn't just change the race and gender. It was, let's make this character cool. And then gave it to Tilda Swinton. Because had that been Michelle Yeoh or Chow Yun-fat doing the exact same role Tilda did, no one would have been like, that's a stereotype, right? They would have been like, holy crap, that's so cool. Because like when she shows up in Endgame, it's like, yes, it's the ancient one. That could have been really dope if that was an Asian character. But again, it's the thinking is like, well, the only way to prevent the stereotype is to erase it altogether. And that's the problematic aspect of like that martial arts stereotype. The problematic aspect of Asians just giving up martial arts, right? Is that like, well, if we just give it to white people, that doesn't help us. Cause like, we're just saying this thing that's intrinsic to a lot of our cultures doesn't belong to us anymore. And I'm saying, let's reclaim that and make that our own. And that's what we're seeing now with Mortal Kombat, with Snake Eyes, with now Shang-Chi. It's this like embrace of this cultural aspect of a lot of our cultures, but also giving us the opportunity to play the leads, to play the complex. Even the villains are complex, right? Like we don't have to be just like the beard stroking or the sexy temptress. We can be everything. And that's what I've always advocated for.
Yeah, I think what you said, I mean, it speaks to a lot of those arguments, those I would say rather excuses used. They really actually what underlies them is a failure of imagination, and a subconscious inability to see that any Asian face could be anything more than a stereotype. Because like you said, they don't say that about white people. They don't say that about white characters if they're fully fleshed out. And what's keeping a writer from fully fleshing out a character just because it's played by an Asian performer?
Right.
And similarly to, I think, just to briefly go back to the Iron Fist, the arguments that you would receive. I mean, I think that people who don't understand why there can be an Asian American Iron Fist, I would imagine are people who don't realize that white and American are not the same thing.
Exactly.
And who also don't realize that there's a difference between Asians and Asian Americans.
100%.
A confusion that I think pop culture has traditionally exacerbated.
I mean, I had that conversation with Henry Golding, about Snake Eyes, because Snake Eyes is another character from the comics who was a white guy who goes to Japan to become best ninja, right? And that one's written by a Japanese American guy. Larry Hama created Snake Eyes, but what we talked about, that whole notion of fish out of water isn't exclusive to white people, right? Like Asian, like the experience of an Asian American is to be a fish out of water in both
everywhere
places,
you go.
Right? Everywhere you go, right? So I think that's kind of the thing that, say what you will about the quality of the movie itself, but like the fact that they were willing to go there and say, hey, let's cast a guy like Henry Golding to play this, traditionally white character whose whole like origin story is that he's this white guy who's out of place in this Japanese ninja clan. But like the fact that they had this Asian American guy walking around and still, learning how to speak Japanese or like not fitting in, like that was something that was to me revelatory, despite the quality of the movie surrounding it. That aspect of itself is that's the reason I advocated for Asian Iron Fist, is that I really wanted an Asian Snake Eyes. So mission accomplished.
Nice. You really backed your way into it very, very well. Yeah, so I think that you've spoken about how there is a way to then be able to properly represent people who are like sort of native or authentically from the culture that is being portrayed without veering into stereotype. And I think a lot of that is by putting more creative control into the hands of people who are from that culture. And that's a cool thing that we've been able to see. Obviously with Shang-Chi, I don't know how it would have been different without Dave Callahan, who's Chinese American, writing the script, or Dustin Daniel Cretton, who is Hapa, directing it. But I kind of don't want to know how that would have been different. And I will say to Marvel's credit, and here's a business note, MCU, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the movies, run by Kevin Feige, is different from the division, the Marvel TV division run by Jeff Loeb that made all those Iron Fist decisions. So those are different departments. But I think that Marvel, the movie side, has really listened, and it feels like they've taken to heart some of the critiques that people have had about, the Asian representation. I won't go into spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen Shang-Chi yet, but I think they're very mindful of it. And I also think Scott Derrickson, the director of Doctor Strange, several years ago after the movie came out, he has been very open and making comments about how he has learned from the feedback regarding the casting of the Ancient One. And I acknowledge that. That's really,
absolutely.
really nice.
And that's the thing though, like I wasn't trying to like assign any like malicious intent. I mean, that's the kind of like dirty little secret about racism though. Like it's never like, it's not about the intent, it's about the outcome, right? And obliviousness isn't an excuse for it, right? But I'm not like assigning blame. Is that they were oblivious. They did think they were doing something good, right? Like we don't want to have the ancient Chinese master, right? So let's get this like really cool actress to play, what would be a stereotypical role otherwise. And what they didn't realize is that like erasure does not absolve the racism. It's in fact it exacerbates it. So and they have, and even Kevin Feige, I believe, has come out recently and saying, yeah, it was a mistake to like change the Ancient One to be a non-Asian person, because again, I think that was just an oblivion. They didn't realize, the secret is just write a fully fleshed character and then cast a person of color. That's mind blowing. Like we didn't know people of color could be fully fleshed out, 3-dimensional.
Because they had not seen it.
They had never seen it, and that's the thing I've always said is like, how you do get better representation. Just write people, write human beings. Don't write tropes. And that's ultimately what any actor wants, is to be able to play a complex human being.
And I think if you really are having trouble with that, then that's probably a experiential issue.
Yeah.
And that's a good opportunity for you to be like, do I actually, do I have deep relationships with people of different backgrounds? If I'm having trouble picturing this is probably because my circle is too small.
Yeah.
So you need to like just go out and live more. And I don't say that with like malice or judgment either, but just literally go out and live more, get experience. Or here's another really important strategy, like give it to somebody who does have that lived experience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so before we get to our final two questions, I want to ask you, I know you haven't seen the movie yet, so what are you looking forward to with Shang-Chi?
I mean, honestly, I alluded to it earlier. I was a big Wong Kar-wai fan growing up, and I love passionately Tony Leung in anything. Chungking is one of my favorite movies. Mood for Love is one of my favorite movies. Infernal Affairs, love them all. That's another example of like having to whitewash it for American audiences, right? Like, just watch Infernal Affairs. Who needs to watch Departed? But he's the one thing I'm looking forward to. More, apologies to Simu, apologies to Nora, apologies to everyone else, Michelle Yeoh even. I want to see Tony Leung like in a Marvel movie. That I had to buy the action figure as soon as it came out, just because like Tony Leung, come on, like people, he's the greatest actor of all time.
Seeing the love for the people who, because people are now beginning to have seen this movie with the premieres and things like that, and seeing the love that Tony Leung is getting on Twitter, I'm starting to feel kind of like a hipster about it.
Yeah.
Like I'm like, guys, where have you been? He is the legend. Like like Leonardo DiCaprio literally played him in The Departed. So that's the caliber, that's the level that we're talking about. And I haven't seen, and I haven't really looked at the Chinese language press, but I haven't seen him do any interviews about Shang-Chi. And so if I had a chance to ask him something, I would ask like, why this film? Like, I am assuming he's been approached by Hollywood in the past. I'm also assuming those opportunities were not very meaty. It was probably going to be like, the one-off, Hua Ping cameos that like Fan Bingbing and other people got,
right.
Just 5 years ago. But like, why did he pick this film? Because his filmography is really diverse and extensive. I mean, he's done every genre and everything, but his global reputation is he's a prestige actor, right? And so why do like a Hollywood superhero tentpole? I'm very curious about it, but yes, I can't wait for you to see him in it. I'm not going to reveal any spoilers or anything, but I think that, I mean, the reaction on Twitter has been euphoric. So
Yeah.
So we always wrap our interviews with two questions. And one we've kind of gone into, the Hollywood Remixed, which is, what is sort of a cinematic sin that has been committed against this theme that you would order a do-over for? And I feel like your answer, you've literally been writing about your answer since 2014, and you can just Google Keith Chow Iron Fist.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, just look at my mentions on Twitter. Like, that's kind of the remix I've been envisioning for a long time, is that just make Danny Rand Asian. But to Marvel TV's credit too, I think what people, first of all, no one watched it, so that's one thing. But the cool thing about the Iron Fist show on Netflix is that even though it got canceled, it ended with essentially the mantle of the Iron Fist being passed down to Jessica Henwick's character. Right? Like, she ends the series with her fists and her sword glowing white, and she becomes essentially the Iron Fist. So, I tell people, like, I bought the action figures, and I have like a Luke Cage and a Daredevil and a Jessica Henwick, Colleen Wing action figure. And I'm like, oh, I have the Defenders. And people are like, you're missing one. I'm like, who? Who am I missing? I have all four. I'm not missing anyone. So, credit where credit's due. Jessica Henwick kind of ends the show as Iron Fist. So in my headcanon, if Iron Fist were to ever emerge in the MCU, if it's Jessica Henwick, I'm all for it. So give us a Colleen Wing Iron Fist series or movie, then I'm down. Other than that, yeah, I think that's the Hollywood remix I've been advocating for forever is already there.
The second question is the hidden gem, which is, what is a project or a resource or some sort of piece of art that exists that sort of is emblematic of the heights or of what this genre could do?
Yeah, absolutely. And we didn't actually mention it. There was a show that came out in that in-between time between the Iron Fist controversy and this like new wave of Asian American martial arts blockbusters, right? And it was a show that was on AMC for 3 seasons called Into the Badlands, created by, and it was led by Daniel Wu, who was like, so many like connections to what we've been talking about. Daniel Wu, like Bruce Lee, Asian American, born in the Bay, but went to Hong Kong to become a star, right? Like he couldn't become a star in America, so he had to go to Hong Kong, and then came back to America in his like late 30s to lead this TV show. Now he's in like
he's in
a big Warner Brothers movie in Reminiscence.
Yeah, exactly, with Hugh Jackman.
So he was the lead in this. He played a guy named Sonny, kind of very loosely based on the Monkey King. It's this like post-apocalyptic martial arts fantasy world created by 2 white guys who created Smallville, Al Gough and Miles Millar. But to their credit, they were able to kind of imbue the show with like, a cast of people of color, like, an Asian lead. In the first season, there was an Asian lead with a black romantic love interest, right? Like just kind of like breaking all of the molds. Their Ancient One character was half black, half Asian, right? Like, so it was like this really cool show, really cool. Like the martial arts, I think, are still unparalleled on TV right now. So that I give them the credit of this kind of like, they were willing to take the leap and cast an Asian American in a martial arts series. Had a cult following. I think it's still on Netflix. So to me, that's the hidden gem, and that's the kind of real, lodestone that started this whole kind of wave of, Louis Tan was also appeared on the show in the 2nd season. He went on to lead the Mortal Kombat movie. Also, like, famously passed over for Iron Fist, so like he's another kind of like through line through our conversation. But yeah, check out Into the Badlands if you can. I think it's worth a watch at least.
Yeah, that's a really great recommendation. I mean, I think that you're right. Like, kind of hats off for them having greenlit that show, really just before it became I'm using this word ironically, a woke and a, sort of, and considered a money-making thing to do.
Yeah.
But it served as a proof of concept.
Absolutely.
Because it showed that such a story was completely viable. These characters were were completely believable as the leading man, as somebody who could have a love interest, as somebody who could kind of carry the whole show. And yeah, kind of chronically underappreciated. I do remember every year during award season, Daniel Wu would really try to campaign for his stunt team to get some recognition. And I don't know if they ever did, unfortunately.
I think it was only until this year that the Emmys even added a stunt category.
Maybe for the Emmys. Yeah, I think for the Emmys, but certainly there's other awards bodies that recognize that sort of thing. And I just don't know if they ever got their due. That's a really good one. I will, if we're going to go like, because everything we've said is a hidden gem is like depressingly from like the last 3 years. So I'll do a throwback and I will say, I'm going to say Vanishing Sun from the 90s. And because I feel like Asian Americans of a certain generation remember this. This was like the one thing we had. It was literally like, I cannot believe it exists.
Right.
But like Russell Wong was briefly a leading man on network television. He had a girlfriend, a beautiful girlfriend, Rebecca Gayheart. Vanishing Sun was one of the last performances of Hang S. Noor, the Oscar winner, who was horrifically murdered shortly after. But it's how do I say? It's like every trope in one, because Russell Wong played like a master violinist who also knew martial arts. I don't remember the storyline very well. I think he came to America in search of his wayward brother, played by the actor-director Simu Liu. And I don't remember anything else about it, honestly. But it was like a hot Asian man.
I was going to say, I just remember
TV.
so many people like had crushes on Russell.
Speaks like flawless English. Dude, Keith, let me tell you, when Russell Wong was in Joy Luck Club, that watermelon scene, I did not understand what that scene meant, but I just knew that it was something I was not supposed to be watching. Yes, Russell Wong.
Not supposed to feel a certain type of way when you're watching that. Yeah.
Shout out to our 90s pioneer, Russell Wong, and Vanishing Sun. I have no idea if that show is available at all, but
Probably
people
not.
should know about it.
Yeah,
it actually happened for a brief moment. It was kind of like with like Joy Luck Club, Vanishing Sun. Those things existed in the 90s. Unfortunately, there was no momentum after that, but I think times have now changed.
Yeah, they needed a hashtag. That was the problem.
Yes, Twitter was invented like, just purely to kind of keep these things sustainable.
Exactly.
This is so much fun, Keith. I always love talking to you. I hope I don't get in trouble for how off the cuff I was in this episode.
Sorry. I know what I bring out of you sometimes, Rebecca. I always get you in trouble.
In my opinions. But a pleasure. You can check out Keith on Nerds of Color, where he has a whole portfolio of podcasts to choose from. But thank you again, Keith. Appreciate your time.
It was a pleasure. I appreciate it as well.
Prior to becoming the Marvel Cinematic Universe's very first Asian lead, Simu Liu was best known to Asian Americans and Canadians as Jung, the estranged son on the Canadian family sitcom Kim's Convenience. Born in Harbin, China, and raised in Canada, Simu earned a business degree from the University of Western Ontario and worked as an accountant at Deloitte before a fortuitous, in retrospect, layoff caused him to pivot to an acting career. In less than a decade, he's gone from serving as an extra on Pacific Rim to a series regular role on Kim's Convenience, and now to Marvel's Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, the reason we're sitting down here today. Simu, it's definitely a pleasure to finally be able to speak to you one-on-one. Thank you so much for making the time. I know that your schedule is pretty packed this month.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Rebecca. It's so great to finally meet you and sort of meet you, because we're not in a studio or anything. But no, I'm really excited.
So I wanted to start out by shouting out an interview you recently did with our mutual friend, Phil Yu, for EW's July cover story, where one of the things you guys talked about was the complicated relationship that Asian Americans, and specifically Asian American men, have to the martial arts trope. Can you talk a little bit more about the two, what you put it as two conflicting paradigms?
Yes, these two conflicting paradigms, the first of which is, I think I said before, martial arts is objectively really effing cool. And some of my favorite movies of all time are incredible martial arts movies, whether they're, Jackie Chan and the way that he choreographs his action, which is so kind of creative and different, or it's, Jet Li, who's so frenetic and so incredibly athletic, or, it's the wuxia films that come out of China, Zhang Yimou's Hero, House of Flying Daggers, like all of those incredible pieces, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, is such a big fan of the genre. And then, of course, the other part of it that I talked about with Phil that I'm sure we're going to get into today is how has martial arts become a limiting factor for Asian people in America? And like you mentioned, Rebecca, specifically Asian men. Well, I'll start by asking this. Have you read an incredible book called Interior Chinatown?
Not yet. That's the Charles Yu, right?
You must read it because it so perfectly encapsulates what this issue is, which kind of really boils down to, as an Asian man, particularly in showbiz, you could say, it almost feels like you only have value if you know martial arts, right? Look at the last, including Shang-Chi, let's look at the last 3 movies that have featured a predominantly Asian cast. So you have G.I. Joe, Snake Eyes, right? You have Mortal Kombat. What do these things all have in common? They have Asian men performing martial arts. And there is kind of like I want to say almost an expectation that if you're an Asian male actor, you must at some point have known or must be prepared to do martial arts, because otherwise, there's a sense of, well, why are we watching an Asian person on screen then? What value do they have if not to entertain us in that specific way? And what I think we really do well in our movie is trying to strike the balance between those two paradigms, is trying to say, look, we are going to make a movie about a superhero or about a character really that it is an incredible hand-to-hand fighter. And that's going to allow us to explore really, amazing kinetic, high-octane action sequences that maybe we haven't seen before in the MCU. But we're also going to dive deep into the character in a way that you may not, have gotten from Rush Hour or Shanghai Noon, And, it speaks to, first of all, a lot of these projects that we're talking about are not directed by Asian people or Asian American people. And so they can't, I found that they don't really speak to the discourse of our lived experiences. And so, I'm going to plug Destin Daniel Cretton here, but he's an incredible filmmaker, directed our movie, directed Just Mercy, directed Short Term 12. You have Dave Callahan, our incredible Asian American screenwriter. And it just feels like at every step of the creative process, the Asian lens has been baked into the DNA of this film. And so I think that that's really important when you're tackling this kind of martial arts stuff, which is in danger of falling into the territory of stereotype and trope. It's so important that we approach it with a degree of sensitivity and nuance.
I was going to ask you about this question later, but since we're talking about Shang-Chi, and I haven't seen the film yet, but just going off of the trailers and that sort of thing. Yes, I definitely intend to. But one thing that kind of struck me is that, from the trailers, yes, you do see sort of Shang-Chi's backstory and the sort of fantastical world that he comes from. But there's also a significant amount of time dedicated to showing him as like a regular dude in America, right? Mm-hmm. With like a regular sort of, wage paying job, goofing off with Awkwafina's character, Katie. Mm-hmm. And, talk to me a little bit about the significance of being able to see this guy who possesses incredible martial arts skills, but has a sort of a more universally relatable backstory and experience, because that to me has been new. A lot of our sort of Asian martial arts icons, the way that they've been portrayed is a little bit inaccessible. Like they kind of are literally mythological.
I want to say exotic, Eastern wise kung fu masters that speak in parables and metaphors and don't understand American customs and humor and talk about things like honor. I've been there. We've been there. We've seen it on screen. And, if I had a nickel for every time I spoke about honor with my parents or friends, I would have no money at all. I think it was important. Like I said, there's a real danger, right? When Asian culture is approached from a white lens, I feel like there's the tendency to exoticize and to polarize us. So when I watch a movie about Asian people that is not made by Asian people, the Asian people inside this movie are like kind of like weird like two-dimensional caricatures of what a white person. I stopped myself from saying white man, but let's be real, it's probably a white man. Yeah. What a white man thinks that Asian people behave like. And if it's a man, generally they tend to be a certain way. And if you're depicting an Asian female character, as you and I both know, Rebecca, it's, they're depicted in a whole other way, sometimes very fetishized, sometimes hypersexualized and all that. Both sides have their problems. But like what you see in our movie, it really didn't take a lot of effort. It was just a bunch of Asian Americans getting together and being like, well, what do we do? We hang out like normal people, and maybe we have a predisposition to sing more karaoke and drink more bubble tea than the average person. But that doesn't mean that we don't do all those things with our friends and goof off and shoot shit and just kind of pass the time.
I'm glad that you shouted out, both Dustin and Dave, because I think it is really important. And I think there's an emerging awareness in the industry that, diversity starts behind the camera and it starts kind of before you even get to the screen. And that true inclusion, like it's kind of got to be baked into the beginning of the creative process.
Yes. I've been a vocal proponent of that. And I've also, I think, been a part of the problem I've worked before in environments where that Asian representation wasn't necessarily apparent behind the scenes, in the writer's room, in the producer's rooms. And it really does, make a difference, because despite people's best efforts, I think you're never going to 100% be able to encapsulate the lived experiences of someone who has just not, like, whose shoes you have just not walked in. And I think it takes a degree of, humility and deference to be able to have the wherewithal to know when to kind of democratize the power that you have in order to, make the best possible product. And I think, I'll use Marvel as a case study of how we've succeeded, but, obviously Kevin Feige, who is our fearless leader, architect of the MCU, not Asian, Jonathan Schwartz, who is our overseeing, creative producer, also not Asian. But what I think where I think they really made the right choice and decision was in understanding the limits of their own kind of perceptions and knowing when to step back and let us tell our story. And that was evident to me from day one. It actually came as a pretty big surprise, because when you join something as big and as well oiled as a Marvel franchise, you kind of expect as the new actor, as the new kid on the block, you just kind of expect to be inserted into the machine and just to be a cog and to be told what to do. But I was very, very pleasantly surprised at how collaborative the environment was at all stages. And I was invited to give creative notes on my character, on the story at large, and to talk about the ways in which I felt like Asian Americans would do something different, or where we may not feel a certain way about something. And I would say it definitely led us to create a better script.
Without sort of sounding the alarms for the Marvel spoiler security team, I mean, are there any just sort of more benign examples that you can share about like what some of those things might be or might have been?
Oh, no, I can absolutely. I will say this. I think there was a lot more of a, when the script was first written, there was a lot more attention paid to this idea of Shang-Chi versus Sean. And Sean is, Shang-Chi's kind of, call it an alias if you want. I just think of it as his English name that he chose for himself. But, I think I was able to shed a little bit of light into the duality of those names and what they mean to a person, that's for us. I mean, we all have our name that our parents gave us, and then our name that, that we Americanize and show to the world. And even a name like Simu, which doesn't feel like an American name, is an anglicized version of what my Chinese name is, which is Simu, which most people can't pronounce because Chinese is Mandarin is a very tonal language. And you just, people who grew up here are just going to have a rough time trying to get that. But I think, I have a very specific relationship with both of my names, and I accept them both as parts of myself. And that was something that I wanted to, that I gave a note on very early on. And it ended up kind of affecting some of the pieces in the story. I can say, and I felt very listened to, and I felt like it was just, the attitude was not defensive at all, because, it wasn't like I was speaking to a room full of white people and trying to make them understand. It was like, oh, like that, they get it. And it just became a lot easier to have those conversations.
That's awesome. I think, you have sort of just demonstrated sort of a very refreshing willingness to be candid about your experiences in this industry. And I think that there's a tendency for people outside of it to sort of put a lot of responsibility on actors for, the projects, because you are the faces, the literal faces of all of the decisions that were made, by a variety of people. And I also realized that, an actor's agency and power sort of grows with their career. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious about where you feel you are right now in both your ability and your own sort of willingness or desire to sort of speak up about these things, or even to sort of choose to even just how much agency do you feel now in your career to say no to projects completely, or to say no to certain aspects of a character or a storyline? And has that changed?
Mm-hmm. It absolutely has changed. I mean, I remember a time, honestly, not that long ago, where I would have auditioned for anything and everything, and it's not that I hated myself. It's not that, I was a race traitor or whatever you want to call it. It was just, the reality of the situation was like, that was the work that was available. And if you don't want to put on an Asian accent, and you don't want to play a slightly caricatured, version of a real person, then you just didn't work. And there is a negotiation that I think every actor of color has to go through when they're starting out. And, depending on what time period you happen to start out in, some of those negotiations are pretty, pretty tough. But for me, it was, definitely didn't feel like I had that agency until very, very recently. But now, I'm fortunate enough, I've got a great team with me at CAA as well, where we're able to go after scripts that we love, regardless of whether the character is written Asian or not, and to really have the ability to break down a door and say, hey, why not? Why haven't you thought of a character that way? And this is the thought that I've put in after reading the script. This is, let me do the work for you. Let me show you how this character can have an authentic, Asian American experience. And then the other thing, the other part of that too is like, so few people in Hollywood get to be in a position where they can greenlight their own projects. And so hopefully, when the movie comes out and hopefully it does, it does the numbers that we all want it to do, I'll be in a position where I can choose the stories that I want to tell. So, I mean, I can say it's an incredibly empowering moment for me, but I can say too, you know, if I am the only Asian American person who gets that power, that should be a failure. That should be considered a failure for all of us, because I can't be the only one. There's a real danger in that. And so, you know, it's going to become an increasing priority of mine to make sure that I'm uplifting other voices as well. And just filling up this space, taking up space with our stories, with our culture, with our just unapologetic energy is what I think is so critical, and what I think is a real opportunity with this moment.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think this is happening, and this is true of pretty much every marginalized community of people. But I think we're certainly in a stage now where there's a tension between the fact that there is an extremely varied array of backgrounds and perspectives and experiences among Asian Americans, and they're also kind of finding a platform for their individual voices to be heard, but there still isn't enough representation for everybody in mainstream culture. So do you feel like a burden, which is, I think, a self-imposed thing, or an expectation, which is imposed by other people, to be able to sort of represent the entire quote unquote community?
I could definitely see how it could be interpreted as a burden. And, you know, let's just be honest. Some days it is, you know, some days I don't want to answer, 20,000 questions about diversity. But the thing that I've come to realize as I look back on my career is that every major break that I personally have had has been because of an Asian creative or an Asian centric, project that's come forth and has given me that opportunity. You talk about Kim's Convenience, which was based on a play written by Ins Choi, and it kind of was hailed as, the first Asian family sitcom in Canada, and then became such a hit on Netflix. I just feel like that's it's such a testament. Like I am a walking testament of what could happen when you open up the gates, when you allow projects like Kim's Convenience to be made. And, even, my first on-screen role in the States was Fresh Off the Boat. And so if it weren't for these, these projects, these very culturally specific projects, I would have no career. And I'm very, very aware of that. So in that way, I feel it's not a burden, but, it's, I guess, a responsibility. It's something that I feel like is a relationship that I've established with my fans, that there's an understanding that I am, in a lot of ways going to be their representative. And I want to continue to speak out and to do projects and to green light and put my name on things that will further our kind of collective cause.
I'm curious about, I think, as you've come up within the Asian American entertainment community, I think, people have known you for a long time. There was Kim's Convenience, there are Wong Fu videos, so you've kind of been our community person, and now you're on like a global stage. So you've always been known as somebody who's candid about your opinions and also very active in terms of engaging with other people on social media. And, as your profile rises, that comes with more critics, that comes with greater scrutiny, both among, I think, the general public, as well as with, shall we say, industry overseers. And I'm just curious about whether or not what your relationship is to the feedback of and it's perfectly valid, I think, to be like, well, I don't even have time to read that stuff, or I don't for my own self-care, I don't, I don't take that in. But
I wish I could honestly say that to you. I wish I were that cool, honestly. And I read interviews all the time about these actors who say that, and I'm like, part of me, I'm stuck between a place of like disbelief and also just like envy, because I'm like, if that's true, teach me how you do it, because I don't know how to shut it off. As as a child born of like the 21st century in the age of social media. No, it's something that I'm still learning how to navigate. And to your point, Rebecca, about where that quote unquote backlash comes from. You mentioned the general public, industry overseers. I'm noticing too now more an increasing backlash coming from within the Asian American community as well. For whatever reason, and I feel like everybody has, when you see an Asian American or Asian Canadian, star on the rise, I feel like if you're watching it happen, I mean, everybody's going to project kind of their vision of what that person should be and what that person should stand for. And, if I'm lucky, then I fit that mold. But if I'm not, and I'm too outspoken on certain things and not outspoken enough on other things, then, there's kind of like a vitriol that sometimes comes out, which is tough, because I was always mentally prepared for the arrows to come from in front of me. But it hurts the most when it comes from behind. You feel like you're doing your best and you're genuinely trying to do the work of representing these, minority voices and investing in a community that I care deeply about. But then at the same time, realizing that, there are people that are not satisfied with the way that the manner in which I do it. And I think it's a constant negotiation of, am I doing the right thing? Are they right? Should I stop listening to them? Do they have a point? And, to be honest with you, it's just, it's my life changes so fast these days that I don't always have the right answer. What I do know is that, if I can, as long as I can act in a way that I can go to sleep in my bed at the end of the night and be okay with myself, then I've done the right thing.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think one of those I think that a lot of that, and we've seen it. I mean, I think that we saw some of that play out with Latinos with like In the Heights and a lot of internal community dissent, which, in my opinion, I think, again, comes from that gap between like the fact that none of our communities are monoliths, and there's not enough representation. And so that's where a lot of the heightened frustration comes from. And one of the things I think is, let's talk about like masculinity. And I think that Asian American masculinity has had a very limited portrayal in pop culture. And also, like on top of that, I don't think it's a stretch to say that probably the most emasculated group of men that we've seen in Western pop culture are Asian men, right? That's a major trope. And
well, when day one, when you like from early adulthood, you kind of learn that there's a stereotype that exists about the size of your manhood and all that. It's definitely gonna do a number on your self-esteem, because you could just kind of go through life like feeling the burden of that stereotype, whether or not it's true. Which it isn't, but then at the same time, everybody thinks it, and you can kind of feel it, and it just changes the way that you carry yourself in a room, because all of a sudden, without people knowing anything about you, you've got your self-confidence kind of robbed from you. And speaking to many of the Asian men that that I consider my best friends growing up, they went through very, very similar struggles. We just didn't see a lot of self-assured Asian men. It was just hard to find, and it wasn't because we're not confident as a people. It's because for whatever the Western stereotyping, the narratives, everything that's kind of been built up over time. And Rebecca, we could go back to the days of Yellow Peril and the Chinese Exclusion Act to really chase down the roots of kind of that anti-Asian sentiment. But how it's kind of manifested today is like, we're still struggling to be seen as equals. Asian men in a certain way, and I always make a point of saying this, but Asian women in a different way as well. I think there's very dangerous rhetoric that sometimes circulates around our community where you see Asian men attacking Asian women and saying, well, you've got all this privilege as an Asian woman because Asian women are seen as more desirable. They're seen as higher on the social hierarchy. And I first of all, I detest hearing about that kind of infighting within a community. I mean, we should be uplifting each other and sticking together. But more than that, it's not difficult to see that Asian men and Asian women both suffer from the same problem, which is that our experiences have been defined by a predominantly white gaze. And so we each experience the consequences of that, and they're different. But there's no, there shouldn't be any animosity in between amongst ourselves. And we should be working together to dismantle, that gaze rather than trying to point fingers and say, well, you don't understand, anyway.
No, I hear what you're saying. And I think I appreciate that. I mean, I do personally believe that the root of this, you nailed it. It's a white supremacist gaze that sort of flattens, so men and Asian American men and Asian American women are flattened in different ways. And not just in like fictional culture, like you mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act. There are historical real world roots to this, right? Where, Chinese American women were literally prostitutes and Chinese American men were not allowed to marry, outside the race by law. And that was in order to keep them from owning land and in order to sort of gain a foothold in this country. And then it has current world ramifications. There was, that study must be at least probably a decade old now, but, there was the famous OkCupid study, that dating site that found that the survey, I don't know if you remember this, like the least desirable, right? We know it, the least desirable demographic for men and women were Asian men and Black women, right? Mm-hmm. And I do believe that has direct causality ties to how they are portrayed.
Absolutely.
That said, I appreciate that, you kind of brought up that because of these sort of the origins of these portrayals, they have created strains of animosity, from Asian men to Asian women. And I have also seen vice versa. Here's what's interesting is just by what you just shared and what we're talking about now, I think for maybe people outside of Asian American circles are realizing that this is a much more nuanced, yes, and really, really complicated dynamic. But what I've seen in pop culture that's interesting is I've kind of seen, not pop culture, but general discourse is that there is now sort of a corrective to the nerd stereotype, which is sort of this celebration of oh, Asian guys can be sexy too. They can be buff heartthrobs. And so you'll see magazine listicles of, best Asian abs, or Twitter threads where people, and, not just Asian people, but people of all races will just sort of, openly thirst after Asian dudes, which is, and that is a clear corrective in many ways to what we've seen for decades and decades and decades, or centuries in pop culture. But at the same time, I think within the Asian American, I'm trying to not use the word community because it feels so monolithic, but among Asian Americans, I think there is, I think you alluded to it, a little bit of emerging backlash, which is is this emphasis on buff Asian guys playing into toxic masculinity? Is it creating a different type of limiting trope? And as a buff Asian man, I'm curious about how, come on, Simu. Nobody can lie. You're ripped. So as a member of the shredded Asian contingent, how do you reckon with that? You are who you are, you look like what you look like. Do you feel how do you sort of balance that?
Yeah, this is first of all a very, very good question, and I'm so happy to be sitting here with you answering it. There has to be a lot of nuance in my response. I will start by saying that there are Asians out there that are far more shredded than I and far more handsome than I. So I don't want to be held as a representative for anybody else other than myself when I'm speaking. But, I feel like this idea that by overcorrecting our emasculation, that we are actively celebrating toxic masculinity at its most kind of stereotypical core, which is like, these buff, tough people who, maybe don't talk about their feelings or act a certain way towards women. I feel like that's very, very valid. My hope is that as Asian men begin to talk about masculinity, they talk about the ways that they've been emasculated, and then we talk about our goals for how we want to develop the discourse, is that we can redefine what masculinity, quote unquote, really even means, because Asian American masculinity as a term is really hadn't been around for all that long. And so why use it to describe all of the flaws of kind of traditional masculinity? Why not define masculinity for ourselves in a way that is body positive, but body positive for all types and inclusive for all gender norms and sexual preferences? And why not celebrate, male vulnerability and being able to communicate feelings and with your male friends and circles? And why not talk about respecting women and uplifting our Asian American sisters and uplifting, all minority groups and being a better ally? Like, why not talk about those things as well? That's something that I very much believe in, because if it's just about abs and it's just about looking buff and shredded and trying to outman the men, then I don't think necessarily that's a conversation that I want to be a part of.
It kind of feels like you're just kind of jumping from one box into a different box,
Yeah.
and it's still like, at the end of the day, it's still.
And we don't like that
productive.
box. That box is like the reason for a lot of what's wrong in the world. So maybe we shouldn't be jumping into that box.
So when we kind of come full circle then and kind of talk now, revisit the idea of Asian martial arts portrayals, in pop culture, because a lot of that, goes hand in hand, where we talked about at the beginning of this conversation. Traditionally, the Asian martial artist portrayals in Western media have been these sort of stoic, they are kind of just very physical forward. Again, I'm only talking about Western portrayals, very, very much focused on the physique, not much focus on interpersonal relationship dynamics at all, and that sort of thing. And you talked, you've talked about reclaiming that trope with Shang-Chi. What does reclaiming that specifically look like to you? In other words, let's say, you can use this project as an example, or even speak generally about if somebody is developing a character right now who's both Asian and a martial artist, what should people be looking for?
I think people should be looking beyond the fighting to look at who this character is, what motivates him, where his insecurities are. I mean, those are the pillars of good character and good storytelling. Not how well can this guy punch, how many different martial arts moves does he know, and like we mentioned before with the Western gaze, when you have non-Asian filmmakers crafting Asian characters, they will tend to lead with those qualities. And I can say this. Going into the audition process for Shang-Chi, I was very not bullish on the idea that I would ever have a chance to book the role. And part of it was because I too bought into that gaze. I was like, you know what? I am not the world's best martial artist. I am not the master of Kung Fu in the way that Shang-Chi is the master of Kung Fu. I am not the tallest, nor am I the buffest, nor do I have the most chiseled jawline, nor do I have the best abs. So what about me is worthy of taking on this momentous, historic role of the first Asian superhero in the MCU to get a titled movie? And I think, thank God that I got a chance to work with Destin and to meet him in person before I went to the screen test process. Because the moment that I met him and started to work with him, something clicked in for me, which is that who I am underneath all of that, all of the walls that I tried to put up in order to deal with the insecurities, the muscles, the outward, the image, who I was on the inside, the sensitivity, the humor, the quirkiness, that was what was going to win me the role. And once I kind of made that mental shift, I really started to believe that I could book it. And it's interesting to me, that journey of an artist, because I did spend so long, and I feel like, artists, whether you're Asian or not, when you haven't made it yet, you're not where you want to be, you want so badly to project an image of what you think other people want to see. And I feel like for so many Asian men, because they come from such a place of insecurity, they want to project, I want to be perfect. I want to be unfazable. I want to be so tough, so jacked. I want to, so good at martial arts. Like that's what people want to see. And frankly, having watched a lot of those, versions of that movie, it's not very interesting. And those characters aren't very accessible because they don't allow us to see the vulnerability and the humanity in a character. And so I hope that when people watch Shang-Chi, that vulnerability is going to be front and center. And that is what's going to make this character iconic, what's going to make this character watchable, compelling, and what is going to make this story different than the rest. And what is going to make our movie a reclamation of martial arts rather than something that is reductive.
Right. Rather than, again, like sort of for an outsider's perspective of what martial arts is and what that, the role it plays. That's awesome. So we always end every interview with two questions. The first one is called the Hollywood Remixed, which is, is there a project or a character from the past that if you could ask for a do-over for, not your past, but in the history of Hollywood. Again, we're thinking thematically here. So Hollywood martial arts character. Is there one that you would sort of like feel like if you were a studio head that you could sort of do over, and how would you do it over?
Gosh. There's so many.
There really are a lot.
This might be controversial, but if it were up to me, I probably would have made Iron Fist Asian American. I think there is a lot of meat potentially with that storytelling of this guy Danny Rand who is trained in a mystical place of Kunlun, but then is an outsider there, and then kind of comes back to the world of New York to try to take over his family business, but is an outsider there. That idea of being an outsider, no matter where you go, that is so distinctly Asian American, and I just feel like there was such an opportunity that was lost to really share that perspective when they made him just another white guy. And so I'll start there. I'll go on by saying I really wish that Breakfast at Tiffany's never had that I'll say Asian character in the loosest of terms.
Right.
And if you could see me, if you can just picture me doing like massive air quotes in the air.
Not recognizably Asian as a human being, but sort of like a living political cartoon. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And just the fact that it was played by Mickey Rooney was just, that much more hurtful. And gosh, it was so, you've thought about this. What are your tops? I'm actually very curious to know.
So, well, my top was also Iron Fist. And I think that every Asian American, like, warned, like they said it, like there were entire treatises written about like, why guys, this is a bad idea. You're missing out a lot of story potential here. But sometimes people have to learn things the hard way. The other one I was going to say was David Carradine in Kung Fu.
Yes,
because that one is, it was just
But I mean, Bruce Lee, for God's sake, Bruce Lee pitched the project.
Yes, precisely. And I don't know, like it just in hindsight, it seems just absurd to like not to just to pass on somebody with the charisma of Bruce Lee. So not just sort of his actual martial arts prowess, like just as one of the greatest martial arts practitioners that was working in the generation, but like also like his genuine charisma. And I don't think I myself appreciated that growing up, you know, because you know, I grew up in the States, you know, we grow up in Western culture, and so you sort of see. I knew about Bruce Lee as a trope before I actually learned anything about him as a performer, as an artist.
Same.
And you know, I remember seeing like, you know, as an adult on YouTube that there's like a black and white TV interview that he did where he's like showing moves to like, gosh, I forget.
I've seen it.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's a screen test when he's 24 years old and he's like punching the air right in front of the studio executive, and he's like, he's just working the room, and he's so like charismatic for, you know, for a 5'5" Asian guy who speaks English with a Chinese accent to like have the presence that he did was truly phenomenal. And I would say a greater feat of mastery than any martial arts that he ever did. I mean, that was the true, you know, genius and superpower of Bruce Lee. And you know, I think it's obviously a testament to him that his shadow is just so looming and so large that literally he created a stereotype single-handedly. Like before Bruce Lee, there was no, Chinese people do kung fu, you're a kung fu man, you know, like there was none of that. And he single-handedly, you know, created, for better or for worse, created it. And you know what? For a while it was better because it was, you know, at least we were being seen and at least we were being celebrated in some way. And when I saw people like Bruce and Jackie and Jet just kicking ass on screen, just kicking the crap out of white people, I mean, there was a part of me that was like, hell yeah. Yeah. You know, the question is, as we move forward into our next, you know, 10, 20, 30 years of discourse, can we find a way to evolve past this conversation of martial arts? And that's something that I'm very curious to know the answer of. I don't want to do martial arts films my entire career. I don't want to be known as a kung fu actor. I feel like it would be a disservice to Bruce and a disservice to his spirit of building bridges, of going where it's unexpected, of traversing the path that's less traveled. You know, that I feel like that is the spirit of Bruce that should be taken and evolved and moved forward, not just the martial arts itself. So yeah, I'm really curious, and that's something that I want for my future, is to continue to go places where we haven't seen Asian men and to show the world that we deserve to be there too, whether that be romantic comedy or, you know, action adventure, but not in a martial arts capacity, you know. But the possibilities are literally endless, and it seems like the only wrong move for me is to just continue doing the same thing.
Yeah, it becomes redundant. And I think what you said about sort of how Bruce Lee sort of originated a possibility, you know, he sort of created a new possible opportunity for Asian American men or Asian men to be seen in this culture that didn't exist before. And then what happened was, because nobody gave any opportunities around that, and because, quite honestly, I think the gatekeepers didn't understand Asian culture, it got turned into a stereotype, you know, and kind of reduced. So the second question is called the hidden gem, which is there a recommendation? It could be a movie, a TV show, a book, a blog, a podcast, whatever it is, but something that you would recommend to people who really want to experience what an authentic and fully dimensional portrayal of an Asian martial artist character or storyline looks like. What would you recommend for our listeners?
a fully recognized Asian martial arts.
And I'm going to say, because the Hollywood's history of this is not great, you can feel free to expand to just something that comes from Asia as well if you want to. We don't have to keep it to Asian American.
Can I say, I mean, this is so glaringly obvious. It's basically like me saying Star Wars is my favorite movie, which it is. But I'll say Hero by Zhang Yimou.
Yes.
I would say that is a story about love and sacrifice and tragedy set with the backdrop of martial arts, where martial arts is used to accentuate the drama and certainly to help move the narrative sometimes, but never as the centerpiece. Never was Hero just going to be a cool action movie where people fought a lot. I mean, the way that Tony Leung plays his character, the chemistry between him and Maggie Cheung, the scene where him and Jet Li are fighting, and they're dipping in and out of the pond.
Yes.
And a single drop of water lands on Maggie Cheung's face, and Tony, and just how beautifully romantic that movie was. I would say if you're looking for true like Chinese martial arts drama cinema, that's where you have to go for sure. That Hero is the gold standard.
Hero is it's an art film, It's so, and I think that there was, it came out, it was like a trio of films, right? It was Crouching Tiger, Hero, and Flying Daggers that came out. And I also agree, Hero was my favorite. It's just, it's breathtaking in its artistry, and visually. And someday it's on my bucket list. I want to go to Jiuzhaigou, which is where I think that scene you're talking about, that showdown between Jet Li and Tony Leung and Maggie Cheung. It's just the most beautiful. It looks like the most beautiful place on this planet. Like it's almost not even on this planet.
And so serene, like seeing the way that, a single foot dipping into the pond creates the ripples and the water is so still. Oh my gosh.
That's a really good one. And I'll also add for you, because you mentioned it earlier, Charles Yu's book, Interior Chinatown.
I love, I'm just going to take like 2 minutes and rave about it. I just love the way that he writes. It's written loosely in the form of a screenplay, where it's not first person or third person, but it's second person. And it's like giving you stage direction. So it's almost as if you're reading, you're reading a movie. But, there's something in that story that really spoke to me. This idea that martial arts can be a source of empowerment, but being the kung fu guy can also be a system of control for Asian men. And it really made me think about all of the ways that I've allowed myself to be limited by this martial arts stereotype. And I think about when I first got started in this industry. And you'll see that when you read the book, there's a very real parallel between the main character in the book too. But when I first got started and I was, working background, making minimum wage, and I was on set, I'd be looking at the other Asian guys in the industry and they'd all be stuntmen. And I would, I just remember being like, oh my God, like that would be the pinnacle of success for me. If I could one day be a stuntman and get beaten up by a white guy and make a living doing that, how incredible would that be? And it was like, I couldn't even fathom being a lead character. I couldn't even fathom having, leading a blockbuster franchise. It was just like not even possible to me because of what I had seen. And the system that I believed that I existed in was that one in which my value was dictated in my ability to do kung fu. And, it really opened my eyes to that system, that invisible, whether you want to call it ceiling or you want to call it the invisible prison that, sometimes we put ourselves in, and why it's so important to break free of that.
Yeah, I think that mentality of just being thankful to be there, and kind of believing that there could be more. Simu, this was a fantastic conversation. I really, really super enjoyed speaking with you, and I really appreciated I think the intentionality with which you think about these things is much appreciated.
Oh, thank you so much. And likewise for me, I think I always really appreciate sitting down and having just a real conversation about this, because, when I'm on the red carpet and people are asking, when they ask me, what does it mean to be the first Asian superhero in the in the MCU with a title movie, or what does it mean to be, when they ask questions like that, what they're really looking for is a soundbite. And I can, and it's very well intentioned, and I really appreciate the opportunity to give that soundbite. But at the same time, how can you possibly communicate the importance of this moment in like 30 seconds? So, I really appreciate being able to just drill deep and have that conversation with you.
Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings comes out on September 3rd. Simu, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks again to Simu Liu and Keith Chow for joining us on Hollywood Remixed. You can read Keith's work and listen to his podcasts at thenerdsofcolor.org. And Simu, obviously, can be seen lighting up the big screen in Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings in theaters September 3rd. Please stay tuned next week when Billions star Asia Kate Dillon stops by to educate us on non-binary identity and representation in Hollywood. And please subscribe to Hollywood Remixed on the podcast platform of your choice so that you don't miss an episode.